The white ceilings and walls of hospital rooms have an amazing ability to plunge a person into a stupor from which the most unpleasant thoughts arise. I lay there, staring at a crack in the ceiling that branched out like a river on an old map. How many people before me had looked at this same crack? How many of them had walked out of here on their own 2 feet? Heart surgery at the age of 68 is a kind of conclusion. It's drawing a line under the years I've lived. What could I count as my achievements? 43 years of marriage to Ebner, 2 children who only call on holidays, and even then, not always. My job as a school inspector, which I left 5 years ago, leaving behind a reputation as a woman feared even by the most notorious bullies and their parents. The monitors around me beeped steadily, counting my heartbeats. This thing let me down 2 days ago when I was cooking dinner. A sudden pain, as if someone had squeezed my chest in a vice, and here I am in the intensive care unit, after emergency bypass surgery. Ebner sat by my bedside the first day, holding my hand with his soft, always warm fingers. He was pale and confused, like a man who had unexpectedly found himself alone. Was he really that scared for me? Doubtful. Over the years, I had learned to read his face like an open book. And now, there was something else in it besides concern for his wife. "You need to rest," I told him on the evening of the first day. "Come back tomorrow." He nodded with relief and quickly gathered his things: a worn crossword puzzle, a thermos of tea, reading glasses in a scratched case. I watched his hurried movements, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was in a rush to get somewhere. "I'll call Clara and Nathan," he said, already standing at the door. They should know. Clara and Nathan. My children, whom I hadn't seen in— how long? 2 years? 3? After that Christmas argument, Clara stopped coming, and Nathan had only ever visited on major holidays. "Mom, you can't control my whole life!" was the last thing Clara shouted as she slammed the door. Well, maybe I was too demanding. But isn't it a mother's job to guide her children? Didn't I know better what they needed? Ebner called them. I had no doubt about that. But none of them showed up in my room the next day or the day after. They sent flowers. Nathan sent peonies. Clara sent lilies. Nathan's note was short. "Get well, Mom." Clara didn't bother with words, just signed the card. I put the flowers on the nightstand by the window and watched them slowly wilt. Ebner didn't come the next day. He called and said he had a cold and was afraid of infecting me after my surgery. It sounded plausible, but his voice was too cheerful for someone with a cold. On the third day, he showed up with a bouquet of carnations, cheap ones from the supermarket. I knew because I sometimes bought them myself when I needed to congratulate a colleague I didn't particularly like. "How are you feeling?" he asked, awkwardly sitting down on the edge of a chair by my bed. "Like my chest has been cut open and then sewn back together," I replied. He grimaced. Ebner had always been squeamish about bodily details. In all our years of marriage, he had never once watched me change a sanitary napkin and would leave the bathroom if I started talking about my feminine problems. A little boy who never quite grew up. "Dr. Bird said the operation was a success," he muttered. "He came by this morning, but you were asleep." "What else did he say?" "That you need time." Ebner fiddled with a button on the sleeve of his old sweater. The thread was almost torn off, and I thought I would have to sew it back on when I got home. He said something about rehabilitation, about having to follow a diet, take medication. I knew he wasn't listening. Ebner never listened when it came to anything important. When I was younger, it drove me crazy. But over time, I learned to compensate for his absent-mindedness with my attentiveness. I always remembered his appointments, his relatives' birthdays, his doctor's visits. I wonder who will remind him of all this when I'm gone. I'll talk to Dr. Baird myself, I said. You never knew how to listen. He smiled guiltily. I'm sorry, Myrna. I'm not used to all this. What exactly was he not used to? Hospitals? The thought that his wife might die? Or the responsibility that now fell on his shoulders now that I was bedridden? A nurse came in to take my blood pressure and temperature. Ebner moved aside to make room for her, and I noticed his gaze sliding over her figure. She was young, with ample breasts that strained against her uniform blouse. I used to be like that too, slim, with high breasts and shiny hair. Ebner used to look at me as if he couldn't believe his luck. Did he look at anyone else like that now? Your blood pressure is still high, Mrs. Dougling, said the nurse, recording the readings in the chart. Try not to worry so much. Thank you, I smiled at her. You're very caring. She smiled back and left. Ebner watched her go, then looked at his watch. I have to go, Myrna. I promised to help Ted with his boat. Ted, our neighbor, had been trying to repair an old fishing boat he bought at a garage sale for 5 years. Ebner regularly helped him, which really meant drinking beer in Ted's garage and discussing baseball games. Of course, I said. Don't forget to take your blood pressure medicine before bed. He nodded, kissed me on the forehead with his dry lips, and left. I watched him go and thought about how, in 43 years of marriage, Ebner and I had never learned to really talk to each other. We discussed the weather, bills, plans for the weekend, but never about our feelings, fears, or dreams. Maybe because Ebner simply didn't have any, or because I never asked? Dr. Bird, a tall man with receding hair and tired eyes, entered the ward. He sat down on the edge of my bed and talked at length about what lay ahead of me. Rehabilitation would take several months. I would need to change my lifestyle and diet and start doing light physical exercises. No stress, no strong emotions. You're lucky, Mrs. Dougling, he said, closing my chart. A few more hours, and we could have lost you. You have a very caring husband. He called the ambulance in time. I nodded. Yes. Ebner called the ambulance. But before that, he rushed around the house for 10 minutes, not knowing what to do, while I sat clutching my chest and tried to explain to him what was happening. In the end, I gave him the number myself. When will I be discharged? I asked. At least another week, Dr. Bird replied. Possibly longer. We need to make sure your condition is stable a week in the hospital. Ebner would be on his own for a whole week. Would he manage? In all our years of marriage, he had never been alone for more than 3 days when I went to visit my sister in Portland. When I returned, I found a mountain of unwashed dishes in the sink, an empty refrigerator, and Ebner in a stale shirt. I hadn't left since. In the evening, a nurse stopped by to see me. Not the young one, but an older woman with kind eyes and wrinkled hands. Is your husband coming today? She asked, helping me into a chair by the window. No, he's busy, I replied. We're not one of those couples who can't live without each other for a minute. She nodded understandingly. My Jim needs his space, too. We've been together for 46 years, and sometimes I think he'd happily run away to a desert island. I smiled. Ebner would never run away to a desert island. He just wouldn't know what to do without me. Who would cook his meals? Who would look after his health? Who would remind him of appointments and birthdays? But he's managing somehow, isn't he? I've been in the hospital for 4 days now, and he hasn't called to ask where the clean socks are or how to turn on the washing machine. I looked out the window at the hospital parking lot. People came and went. A young couple with a newborn in a car seat. An elderly man struggling to get out of a taxi. Medical workers in blue uniforms smoking at the entrance. Life went on, and I was cut off from it, locked in this ward with monitors and IVs. For the first time in many years, I had no control over what was happening. I didn't know what was going on in my house, what my husband was doing, what he was thinking. That thought should have frightened me, but instead I felt a strange relief. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. Maybe that's how Ebner had felt all these years. Maybe that's why he so rarely argued with me, letting me make all the decisions. Maybe he liked being led. The nurse helped me back into bed and gave me some pills. "Get some rest, Mrs. Dougling. You'll feel better tomorrow." I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, images from the past floated before my eyes. Here is Ebner, young, with thick dark hair, nervously fiddling with his tie before our first date. There he was, pale with excitement, waiting for me at the altar. There he was, holding newborn Clara in his arms, afraid to move so as not to wake her. There he was, standing with his shoulders slumped, while I scolded him for another forgotten anniversary or lost keys. Was he ever happy with me? Did he love me as much as I thought? Or was he just unable to say no? On the fifth day, Ebner came with magazines and fruit. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt ironed. He never ironed his own shirts. "You look well," I said, looking him over. "Are you getting enough sleep?" "Yes, quite," he said, adjusting his glasses. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Dr. Bird says I'm recovering faster than expected. I may be discharged in a few days." Something flashed in his eyes. Anxiety? Disappointment? He quickly regained his composure. "That's wonderful, Myrna. I'm so happy for you." He didn't look happy, more like worried. I decided to test my guess. "Although, maybe I should stay here a little longer. The doctor says I'll need constant care at home. You know I don't like being a burden." "You're not a burden," he said quickly. "I'll manage. Although I'm not sure I can take time off work." Ebner had been retired for 7 years. After 40 years as a mailman, he finally hung up his uniform and never took it out again. What job? What was he talking about? "Ebner, you're retired," I reminded him. He blushed. "Yes, of course, I meant my project with Ted. We've almost finished the boat, and I promised to help him launch it next weekend." I nodded, pretending to believe him. Ebner was never good at lying. His red ears and shifty eyes gave him away. Right now, his ears were burning like signal lights. "Of course, your boat," I smiled. "How could I forget?" He visibly relaxed and began to talk about some details that he and Ted had recently finalized. I wasn't listening. Instead, I watched his face, his gestures, how he lit up when talking about his plans without me. When he left, I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Something had been going on in my house while I was here. Something Ebner didn't want me to know about. Something that made him iron his shirts and comb his hair more carefully than usual. Different versions flashed through my mind. Maybe he was just enjoying his freedom? Maybe for the first time in many years, he could do what he wanted without asking my permission or listening to my advice. Maybe he was just taking a break from me? But there was another explanation. One I tried not to think about, but which knocked insistently at my consciousness. An ironed shirt, combed hair, lies about work. Nervousness at the thought of me coming home soon. Ebner had met someone. Someone who made him care about his appearance. Someone he enjoyed spending time with. Someone he didn't want to leave to visit his sick wife. That thought should have hurt me, but instead of pain, I felt only cold curiosity. Who is she? How long has this been going on? What did he see in her? And most importantly, what will I do when I find out the truth? I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. "Doctor, Bird will come tomorrow and we will discuss my discharge. I need to gather my strength before returning home. I have a lot to learn and a lot to figure out. As I lay there, listening to the beeping of the monitors and the noise of the hospital corridor outside the door, I thought about how strange the heart is. It can fail at any moment, even when everything seems to be fine, just like the people we think we know best. The day of my discharge came on the 10th day of my stay in the hospital. Dr. Bird spent a long time explaining to me what medications I should take, and in what dosage, what diet I should follow, and what exercises I should do. Ebner stood nearby, nodding seriously, but I knew he wouldn't remember half of it. Usually, that wasn't a problem. I always kept track of all the medical appointments in our family. But now, when it came to my health, I needed him to be more attentive. "Did you understand everything?" I asked when the doctor left, leaving us alone in the room. Of course. Ebner put the papers with the recommendations in the folder I had given him. Medication, diet, rest. Nothing complicated. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. In 43 years of marriage, I had learned to recognize every nuance of his mood. Right now, he was tense, even though he was trying to hide it. It wasn't because of my health. I knew that for sure. It was because of something else. The nurse brought a wheelchair to take me down to the exit. Hospital rules. Even if you can walk on your own, they still wheel you out as if you were a helpless invalid. Ebner walked beside me, carrying my bag and a bouquet of flowers from the nurses. "I'll get the car," he said when we reached the main entrance. "Wait here." He walked quickly across the parking lot to our old sedan. I watched his gait, more confident than usual. Ebner always walked with a slight stoop, as if apologizing for his presence. But now his back was straight, his step firm. And there was another detail. New pants. Dark blue, well-fitting, clearly not the ones that had been hanging in our closet for the last 10 years. When he pulled up and got out to help me into the car, I noticed something else. New cologne. Not the cheap stuff I bought him every Christmas, but something more expensive, with woody notes. The scent was pleasant, but unfamiliar, not belonging to the Ebner I knew. "New cologne?" I asked, settling into the passenger seat. He paused for a moment, then shrugged with feigned nonchalance. "Yeah, decided to try something new. Ted recommended it. His wife gave it to him, but he didn't like it." That was a lie. Ted hadn't used cologne since he developed an allergy 5 years ago. And his wife Martha would never have bought such an expensive perfume. She was known for being thrifty. "It suits you," I said, deciding not to pursue the subject further. Ebner started the car and we drove off. The interior was unusually clean. Usually you could find candy wrappers, old receipts, and pencil stubs there. Ebner was never known for his tidiness, and this was another area of our life that I controlled. Once a week, I would go through the car with a vacuum cleaner and wet wipes, throw out the trash, and wipe down the dashboard. But now, after 10 days of my absence, the car looked like it had just left the dealership. "Did you clean the car?" I asked, running my hand over the clean upholstery. "Oh, yes." He glanced at me quickly. "I thought you'd prefer to ride in a clean car." After the hospital, it was thoughtful and completely unlike Ebner. In all the years of our marriage, he had never once taken the initiative to clean up, neither the house nor the car. He didn't notice dirt, dust, or clutter until I pointed it out. "Thank you," I said. "That's very thoughtful of you." He smiled, clearly pleased that I didn't ask any further questions. We drove through the familiar streets of Bakersfield. It was a clear, sunny day, typical of California even at this time of year. Ebner turned on the radio. Some contemporary music I didn't recognize was playing. Usually, our car played old hits from the 60s and 70s that Ebner loved. Or classical music, which I preferred. "What station is this?" I asked. "I don't know. I was just flipping through and stopped on this one. He quickly changed the station to a more familiar one, with melodies from our youth. Another lie. Ebner was conservative in his musical tastes and never experimented with new stations. If anyone was flipping through the radio stations in our car, it wasn't him. I looked out the window, but I didn't see the landscape behind the glass, only the reflection of my husband. His profile, so familiar and yet suddenly so foreign. New clothes, new cologne, new music, new confidence. What else had changed in those 10 days? We turned onto our street, a quiet suburban lane with neat houses behind low fences. Our house stood in the middle of the block, a single-story house with a small front yard and a patio in the back. Unremarkable, just like dozens of others in our neighborhood. We bought it 35 years ago when Ebner got a promotion at the post office, and we had lived here ever since, changing only the furniture and appliances as needed. Ebner parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. "Well, here we are," he said with feigned cheerfulness. "Welcome home." He got out and walked around the car to help me out. His concern was unusual and a little annoying. He usually left me to deal with things like this on my own. "I'm not disabled, Ebner," I said, pushing his hand away. "I can walk myself." "Of course." He stepped back, but remained hovering, ready to catch me at the first sign of weakness. I walked slowly toward the house, feeling my heart pound. Not from physical exertion, from tension. What would I find inside? What had changed in my absence? Ebner unlocked the door and let me go first. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Fresh, floral, not belonging to our house. Usually, it smelled of old books, coffee, and that specific smell that furniture acquires after decades of use. But now there was a scent of lavender in the air and something else, something sweet and feminine. "Did you buy air freshener?" I asked, looking around. "Yes," he replied quickly. "I thought the house needed to be aired out before you arrived." "It's been closed up, another lie." Ebner had been here every day, coming here after his hospital visits. The house couldn't have been closed up. I walked into the living room. At first glance, everything was as usual. The sofa against the wall, the armchair by the window, the TV in the corner, the bookshelves filled with my detective novels and gardening reference books. But upon closer inspection, I noticed changes. A vase of flowers on the coffee table, fresh, clearly bought today. A new pillow on the sofa, bright turquoise, completely out of place with our muted color scheme. And most importantly, no dust on the surfaces. Ebner cleaned, and he did it thoroughly. "Did you change the pillow?" I asked, pointing to the sofa. He hesitated. "Oh, that. Yes. The old one was torn, so I had to buy a new one. I chose the first one I saw. The first one he found would have been brown or beige, like everything else in our house. Not bright turquoise, the color of the tropical sea." I walked into the kitchen. The changes here were even more noticeable. There was a new coffee maker on the countertop, stylish, chrome-plated, with lots of buttons. Our old drip coffee maker was standing nearby, but it looked as if it hadn't been used for several days. In the sink were clean wine glasses, even though Ebner and I never drank wine at home, preferring whiskey, him, and sherry, me. "New coffee maker?" I asked, pointing to the chrome monster. "Yes, the old one was broken," he replied, not looking me in the eye. "And this one was on sale." I opened the refrigerator. Usually, there were a few vegetables, milk, eggs, and leftovers from last night's dinner. Now it was stuffed to the brim with fresh fruit, yogurt, cheese, a bottle of white wine, and containers of salad. Food that Ebner never bought and rarely ate. "Have you decided to start eating healthy?" I asked, closing the door. "Dr. Bird said you need a special diet." he replied. Nah, I've prepared for it. That might have been true if it weren't for the strawberry yogurt, which I couldn't eat because of my allergy, and the wine, which was strictly forbidden after my surgery. I slowly walked through the kitchen into the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The smell was stronger here, definitely women's perfume, expensive, with hints of jasmine. I pushed open the door to our bedroom. The bed was neatly made, not the way I usually made it, but differently, with decorative pillows arranged in artistic disorder. I had seen this style in interior design magazines, but I had never practiced it myself, considering it a waste of time. On the nightstand on Ebner's side was a framed photograph, a new one, not the one that had been there before. In the old one, we were together on our silver wedding anniversary. In the new one, he was alone, 20 years younger, smiling, with a fishing rod in his hands. I went to the closet and opened it. Ebner's clothes were neatly hung, each shirt on a separate hanger, trousers with creases, jackets he hadn't worn in years. On the shelf were boxes of shoes, polished, as if new. Ebner had never taken such care of his clothes before. He usually stuffed his shirts in haphazardly, and his only decent shoes were always covered in dust. I looked into the bathroom. There were new bottles on the shelf by the sink, expensive brand-name men's shampoo, shower gel with an exotic scent, aftershave. Ebner always used cheap shampoo from the supermarket and shaving foam that I bought for him on sale. Returning to the bedroom, I sat down on the edge of the bed. My head was spinning, and not from the medication. It was from the realization that my world was falling apart, and I hadn't even known it until I ended up in the hospital. I had been too busy controlling every aspect of our lives to notice that my husband had changed. Ebner entered the bedroom with my bag. "Where should I put your things?" he asked, stopping in the doorway. "On the chair," I replied. "I'll sort them myself." He placed the bag by the dressing table and shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, clearly unsure of what to do next. "Do you need anything? Tea, perhaps?" "No, thank you." I smiled wearily. "I'll just lie down for a bit. The journey has tired me." He nodded with obvious relief. "Of course, rest. I'll be in the living room if you need me." He left, closing the door behind him. I leaned back on the pillows and closed my eyes. I needed to think, to plan my next steps. Something was going on in my house, with my husband, and I needed to figure out what it was before I did anything. Muffled sounds from the TV came from the living room. I could hear Ebner walking around the house, opening and closing cupboard doors, talking to someone on the phone. Too quietly for me to make out the words. I didn't notice when I fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of the front door closing. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the window. I looked at my watch. It was almost 6 in the evening. I had slept for several hours. Getting out of bed, I walked over to the window. Ebner was standing by the mailbox at the corner of our property, taking out the letters. It was a normal, everyday activity that I had seen thousands of times before. But now it looked different. Ebner wasn't just picking up the mail. He was taking out his phone, checking something, quickly typing a message, then glancing back at the house, putting his phone back in his pocket, and returning with the letters. I stepped away from the window, not wanting him to notice me. A few minutes later, the front door opened again, and I heard his footsteps in the hallway. "Myrna?" He peeked into the bedroom. "Are you awake?" I brought the mail. "Yes." I sat on the edge of the bed. "Anything interesting?" "Just bills and advertisements." He put the stack of envelopes on the nightstand. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I lied. In fact, my chest hurt, and my head was splitting from the tension. "Can you bring me a glass of water?" "I need to take my medicine." He nodded and left. I quickly glanced through the mail. Indeed, only bills and advertising brochures. Nothing personal, nothing unusual. Then why was he checking his phone at the mailbox? Who was he texting? Ebner returned with a glass of water and my pills. "Here you go," he said, handing me the glass. "Are you hungry? I can make dinner." "Ebner, you've never cooked dinner in your life," I remarked, swallowing my pills. He looked embarrassed. "Well, I could order something, or heat up a frozen pizza." "No need," I got up. "I'll make something myself. I need to move around. Dr. Bird said moderate activity is good for me." "But you just got out of the hospital," he protested. "You need to rest." "I need normality," I snapped. "Day and cooking dinner is normal for me." He didn't argue, just nodded and left the room. I followed him to the kitchen, deciding to make something simple, an omelet with greens and toast. While I was cracking eggs into a bowl, Ebner sat at the table, checking something on his phone. He used to have an old push-button phone that he only used for calls. Now he had a brand-new smartphone in his hands. "New phone?" I asked casually, beating the eggs. "Oh, yes," he said, quickly putting the phone in his pocket. "The old one broke, so I had to buy a new one." The salesperson said this one was the simplest another lie. The simplest smartphone wouldn't cost as much as this one, with its large screen and slim body. And Ebner's old phone worked fine. I saw him using it at the hospital. "How do you like it? Is it hard to figure out?" I turned on the stove. "It's fine," he shrugged. "Ted helped me set it up." Ted, who couldn't even set up his DVD player without his son's help. Another lie, petty and meaningless, like all the others. Why did Ebner lie about such trifles? What was he trying to hide? I made dinner, and we ate in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. After dinner, Ebner volunteered to wash the dishes. Another unusual offer on his part. I didn't refuse, citing fatigue, and went into the living room. Sitting in my chair, I listened to Ebner clattering with the dishes in the kitchen and thought about what I had learned that day. New clothes, new cologne, new phone, a clean car, scented air in the house, a bright turquoise pillow, wine glasses in the sink, strawberry yogurt in the fridge, and most importantly, the scent of women's perfume, subtle but distinct, especially in the bedroom and bathroom. Everything pointed to one thing. Ebner was having an affair. He had met a woman who had changed his habits, his appearance, his attitude toward life. A woman who was in our house, used our bathroom, and possibly slept in our bed. A woman with whom he corresponded, standing by the mailbox so that I wouldn't see. The logical solution would be to make a scene, demand an explanation, and kick him out of the house. But I felt neither anger nor resentment, only cold curiosity and a strange, almost detached desire to know the truth in all its details. Who was she? How old was she? What attracted Ebner to her? And most importantly, how long had this been going on? Instead of confrontation, I decided to observe and gather information. Ebner didn't know I was onto him, and that gave me an advantage. I could watch his actions, his conversations, his movements, without arousing suspicion. And when I knew enough, I would decide what to do next. Ebner entered the living room, drying his hands with a kitchen towel. "The dishes are clean," he announced with a hint of pride in his voice. "What do you want to do now?" "Watch TV? I think I'll go to bed," I replied, getting up from the chair. "It's been a tiring day." "Of course," he nodded. "I'll sit here for a while longer." "I don't want to disturb you. We used to always go to bed together. It was our ritual. The evening news. Then I would read in bed while Ebner took a shower. Then we would turn off the lights and talk about the day that had passed and our plans for tomorrow. But now he clearly had no desire to join me. "Don't stay up too late," I said, heading for the bedroom. You need to rest too. I won't. He smiled with relief, glad that I wasn't insisting on his company. In the bedroom, I changed into my nightgown and got into bed without turning on the light. Through the half-open door, I could hear Ebner walking around the house, talking to someone on the phone, too quietly for me to make out the words. Then the front door opened and closed quietly. I went to the window and saw Ebner standing by the mailbox again, talking on the phone and gesturing with his free hand. After talking for a few minutes, he put the phone in his pocket and returned to the house. I quickly lay back down in bed and closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. Ebner looked into the bedroom, stood in the doorway for a few seconds, then quietly closed the door and went into the living room. Through the wall, I could hear the muffled sounds of the TV, but I knew he wasn't watching it. He was probably texting her, telling her that I was back and that they needed to be careful. Maybe he was arranging to meet her when I was asleep or taking medication that made me drowsy. I lay in the dark, listening to the ticking of the clock and the distant noise of the street, thinking about how my life had changed in those 10 days. From a confident woman in control of every aspect of her existence, I had become a patient with a sick heart, whose husband didn't seem to mind at all. On the contrary, he seemed to have blossomed in my absence, finding a new life, new interests, new love. My heart ached, but not from the pain of betrayal, but from something else, from the realization that all these years I may have prevented Ebner from being himself, imposing my rules, my routine, my ideas of what our life should be like on him. And now that I had temporarily loosened my control, he had shown his true nature, a man capable of change, of passion, of lies. Well, I'll give him enough rope to hang himself. I'll watch, gather information, find out the details, and then, when I know everything I need to know, I'll decide what to do. After all, no one knows Ebner better than I do. No one knows his weaknesses, his fears, his secrets. And if anyone thinks they can just walk into our lives and take away what has been mine for 43 years, they are sorely mistaken. I didn't know who she was, this woman, with the scent of jasmine and a taste for turquoise pillows. But I was going to find out. And when I did, she would regret ever meeting Ebner Dougling. 2 weeks after I returned home, I was going to Dr. Baird for a checkup. It was the first trip I had to make on my own. Ebner said he couldn't accompany me because of an important meeting with Ted about the boat. That was fine with me. Over the past 2 weeks, I had come to the conclusion that I preferred to watch him from the shadows, gathering clues bit by bit. And there was plenty of evidence. Mysterious phone calls in the garden, sudden trips to the grocery store that took twice as long as usual, the scent of another woman that sometimes lingered on his clothes. I watched silently, not showing that I knew, and Ebner seemed to believe he was getting away with it. The taxi was supposed to pick me up at 11, and by 10:30 I was completely ready. Ebner had already left, kissing me on the cheek with unnatural care. "If anything goes wrong, call me right away," he said, standing in the doorway. "I don't want you to overexert yourself." I smiled and promised to be careful. He left, and I sat by the window, looking out at the empty street. I wondered if he really had met with Ted, or was that another lie? The taxi arrived on time, and soon I was sitting in Dr. Bird's waiting room, leafing through an old magazine. The appointment was scheduled for 12, but I was seen at 11:45. The patient before me didn't show up. Dr. Bird seemed pleased with my progress. My blood pressure had stabilized, the scar was healing well, and I had almost no shortness of breath when exerting myself. "You're recovering very well, Mrs. Dougling," he said, looking over my test results. "Keep taking your medication as scheduled, and in a month we can reduce the dosage." "Thank you, doctor," I said, buttoning my blouse. When will I be able to resume my normal activities? What activities do you have in mind? He raised an eyebrow. Gardening, I explained. Long walks. Maybe even traveling. It's too early to think about traveling. He shook his head. But light gardening and walks in the neighborhood are perfectly acceptable. The main thing is not to overexert yourself and to monitor your condition. We discussed my medication, and by 12:20 I was free, much earlier than I had planned. Usually after my appointment, I would go to the cafe across from the hospital to have a cup of tea and collect my thoughts. But today, something told me it would be better to go home. I hailed a taxi on the street and gave him my address. If Ebner really had met with Ted, my early return wouldn't change anything. But if he had lied, well, it was time to find out. The taxi driver was quiet, which I was grateful for. I didn't feel like talking. I looked out the window at the familiar streets of Bakersfield passing by and thought about how my life had changed in the last month. A heart attack, surgery, the discovery of Ebner's secret. It was as if the universe had decided to test me in every way possible. When the taxi stopped at our house, I noticed a car parked nearby. A small red sedan I had never seen before. It was a woman's car. There was a stuffed animal hanging from the rearview mirror and a turquoise bag on the back seat. After paying the taxi driver, I slowly walked toward the house. Ebner was nowhere to be seen in the yard, but his old sedan was parked in the driveway. So he was home, and judging by the red car on the street, he wasn't alone. Instead of using the front door, I walked around the house and entered through the back door, which led directly to the kitchen. The door was unlocked. Ebner often forgot to lock it, despite my constant reminders. There was no one in the kitchen, but I immediately noticed signs of someone having been there. 2 coffee cups in the sink, a box of pastries from an expensive bakery on the table, and a bottle of wine, opened and half empty. Ebner didn't drink wine, especially during the day. Muffled voices and laughter came from the bedroom. A woman's, melodious. I walked silently down the hallway, each step difficult, not because of weakness after the operation, but because of the tension that gripped my whole body. The bedroom door was ajar. I stopped and listened. "Are you sure she won't be back early?" asked a woman's voice. "I don't want any scenes." "Absolutely," Ebner replied, with a confidence he never had when talking to me. "Her reception ends at 1, then she always has tea at the cafe. She won't be home before 3. "I still feel uncomfortable," the woman's voice sounded doubtful. "It's her house, Ebner." "Her bed?" "Soon it won't matter," he said with a hint of impatience. "I told you it's all decided." "I just need to pick the right moment, do you promise?" "I promise, Siona." "You know I never loved her the way I love you." I froze. It hurt more than I expected. Not the fact of the betrayal. I had already come to terms with that. But these words, spoken with such conviction, "Never loved her the way I love you." 43 years of marriage, and all this time he didn't love me? There was a rustle in the bedroom, then quiet laughter, and I realized I had to act now before I lost my resolve. I pushed the door open and went in. They were on our bed. Ebner was wearing an unbuttoned shirt, his thinning hair tousled. Next to him was a young woman, much younger than him, maybe 35. Dark hair, clear blue eyes, a slender figure in a simple blue dress that was now pulled up above her knees. Beautiful. Even I couldn't deny it. For a moment, there was absolute silence. They stared at me, frozen like rabbits in the headlights. I looked at them, absorbing every detail of the scene. The rumpled sheets, their intertwined hands, the bottle of wine, and 2 glasses on the nightstand, the clothes scattered across the floor. Ebner was the first to come to his senses. He jumped out of bed, frantically buttoning his shirt. "Myrna!" His voice broke. You're early! Did the appointment end sooner than expected? The woman, Siona, remained sitting on the bed, but hastily pulled her dress down to cover her knees. Her face was crimson with embarrassment. Dr. Bird is pleased with my progress, I said calmly, as if answering a routine question. He said I'm recovering faster than expected. Ebner shifted his gaze nervously from me to Siona and back again. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't manage the buttons. Myrna, I can explain. It's... He fell silent, clearly unsure how to continue. What could he say? That it wasn't what I thought? That Shona was just helping him look for something in bed? That they had accidentally fallen onto the bed together? I looked at him, waiting to see what ridiculous lie he would come up with this time. But instead, a wave of laughter suddenly rose up inside me. Loud, sincere laughter that burst out of me against my will. The situation was so absurd, so predictable, that I couldn't help but laugh. They looked at me in amazement, clearly not understanding my reaction. Ebner looked as if he expected me to grab a knife and lunge at them. Suni just froze, watching my fit of laughter with wide eyes. When I finally calmed down, I wiped the tears from my eyes and smiled at them. It's okay, dear, don't worry, I said, with a gentleness that surprised even me. I'm not going to make a scene. Ebner looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. You're not angry? He asked incredulously. Of course I'm not thrilled with the situation, I shrugged, but anger is an unaffordable luxury in my condition. Dr. Bird has strictly forbidden me to get nervous. Ebner exchanged glances with Siona, who looked just as puzzled. She finally got out of bed and awkwardly adjusted her dress. Mrs. Dougling, she began, but I raised my hand to stop her. No need for apologies, dear, I said, and please call me Myrna. Since we share the same man, we can do without formalities. Her eyes widened even more. She glanced at Ebner again, as if seeking his support, but he looked as lost as she did. Myrna, I don't understand, he finally managed. I thought, that I would scream? Break dishes? Kick you out of the house? I smiled. Maybe that would have happened if I hadn't spent 2 weeks thinking about our life. You know, a heart attack makes you reevaluate a lot of things. I turned to Zion, looking at her more closely. Young, but not so young as to be an awkward match for Ebner. Modestly dressed, without excessive makeup, with an intelligent face. Not a frivolous girl, but a mature woman who knows what she wants. I suggest we all have some tea, I said, and talk like civilized people. What do you say? They exchanged puzzled glances again, and then Ebner nodded uncertainly. Yes, of course. Tea. That's a good idea. Wonderful, I smiled. Then let's go to the kitchen. And, Siona, don't forget your purse. I pointed to the small turquoise bag lying on the dresser. She flinched and quickly grabbed the bag, clutching it tightly to her chest as if it were a shield. I turned and walked to the kitchen, feeling them follow me at a safe distance. In the kitchen, I set about making tea, moving with deliberate slowness. Ebner and Siona sat down at the table, keeping their distance from each other, as if trying to convince me that there was nothing between them. Funny, considering I had just caught them in bed. I'll make some green tea, I said, taking a tin can out of the cupboard. It's good for the heart. Do you drink green tea, Siona? Yes, her voice was quiet. I like it. Perfect, I smiled over my shoulder. And we have almond cookies to go with the tea. Or would you prefer these cakes? I nodded toward the box I had noticed earlier. Siona blushed even more, if that was possible. The cakes. I bought them at Sweet Corner. I thought Ebner would like them. He loves the almond croissants from there, I said, putting down the teapot. He always asks me to buy them on Saturdays. She glanced quickly at Ebner, who was staring at the table, avoiding her gaze. I didn't know, she mumbled. Of course you wouldn't know, I shrugged. You haven't known each other very long, have you? Ebner finally looked up. Myrna, maybe we should talk in private. Why? I took 3 cups out of the cupboard. I'm sure Siona has no secrets from you, and you have no more secrets from me. So we can speak frankly. The kettle boiled, and I made tea. Then I took out a plate, put some cookies from the box on it, and set everything on the table. I sat down opposite them, smiling as calmly as if it were a normal tea party with guests. So, Siona, I began, taking a sip, tell me about yourself. What do you do? She looked at Ebner again, but he seemed completely absorbed in examining his cup. I work as an administrator at the Aphrodite Beauty Salon, she finally replied, on Maple Street. Oh, I know that place, I nodded. It's a good salon, a little pricey, but the quality is there. How long have you been working there? Almost 5 years. She relaxed a little when talking about her job. Before that, I was a stylist somewhere else, but I decided to change careers. And how do you like administrative work? Isn't it boring? No, I like it. She smiled slightly. I like organizing things, creating systems, and communicating with people. How interesting. I took another sip of tea. Where do you live, if you don't mind me asking? On Oak Ridge Avenue, she replied. I have a small apartment there. Oak Ridge Avenue was in a decent neighborhood, not the most expensive, but not cheap either. An apartment there would cost about $1,500 a month. Not bad for a beauty salon administrator. With your parents or alone? I continued. Alone! She looked away. My parents live in Sacramento. What about another family? A husband, children? I asked with an innocent expression, even though I knew the answer perfectly well. No, she shook her head. I was married, but we divorced 3 years ago. No children, I nodded as if this were the most normal small talk. Yage, and how did you meet Ebner? Ebner finally intervened. Myrna, do you really want to know all these details? Of course, I shrugged. It's natural curiosity. It's not every day you find out your husband is seeing another woman. Besides, I'm really interested in how you, who never took the initiative in our marriage, suddenly found the courage to start an affair. Siona lowered her eyes. But then, as if she had made a decision, she looked up and looked me straight in the eye. We met in the park, she said quietly but firmly. I was walking my sister's dog, and he was sitting on a bench. We started talking about a book he was reading. A book? I couldn't hide my surprise. Ebner was reading a book in the park? Yes, it was an Agatha Christie mystery. Siona nodded. I love her novels too, and we started discussing who the murderer was. Ebner never read detective stories. At least, not in front of me. He preferred sports magazines and crossword puzzles. Another discovery. When was that? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. About 6 months ago, Siona replied after a pause. In April. 6 months. All that time, while I was taking care of the house, cooking meals, washing his shirts, Ebner was seeing this woman. Maybe he told her about me. Maybe he laughed at my habits, at my strictness, at my belief that our marriage was strong. And you started dating right away? I continued questioning him, ignoring the pain that began to throb in my chest. No. Siona shook her head. At first, we just saw each other in the park sometimes and talked. Then we started meeting in cafes. Ebner he was just a friend. I didn't even know he was married until he told me a few weeks later. I looked over at Ebner. who was sitting with his head down. You weren't wearing your wedding ring? I. I took it off when I went to the park, he muttered. It rubbed my finger when I was reading. Another lie. The ring had never rubbed his finger in 43 years of marriage. He just took it off to appear free. I see, I said, turning back to Zion. And when you found out he was married, that didn't stop you? She blushed. I tried to stop seeing him. I really did. But we kept running into each other in the park, and talking to him it was important to me. Ebner understood me like no one else did. I suppressed a bitter laugh. Ebner, who had barely said a dozen sincere phrases to me in all the years of our marriage, had suddenly become a master of understanding. And when did things get serious? I asked, sipping my now cold tea. After my birthday in July, Shona replied after a pause. Ebner gave me a book I had been looking for a long time. The first edition. It was so thoughtful of him. I remembered July. Ebner said then that he had spent a considerable amount of money on new fishing tackle. I scolded him for being wasteful. It turns out the money went to a gift for his mistress. And you've been seeing each other regularly ever since, I said. Not as a question, but as a statement. Yes, Siona lowered her eyes. At first, only outside the house. But then, when you were hospitalized, you took advantage of the situation, I finished for her. No. She raised her head. I mean, I didn't imagine it that way. We didn't plan it. Ebner was so upset about your condition. He needed support. And you supported him in my bed. I couldn't hold back the sarcasm. Ebner finally spoke, his voice sounding unexpectedly firm. Myrna, I understand your pain and anger. But you shouldn't blame Siona. It's my responsibility. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. I looked at him in surprise. He'd never spoken to me in such a tone before. Confident, almost authoritative. He always gave in, always apologized, always let me lead. And now he was defending another woman from me. You're right, I said after a pause. I'm sorry, Sion. It's not your fault that my husband decided to break the vows he made to me 43 years ago. Sion looked as if she was ready to sink through the floor. I never meant to hurt you, she said quietly. I swear. I believe you, I nodded. And, strange as it may seem, I don't hate you. Perhaps because I understand too well what it's like to love Ebner Dougling. Ebner looked at me in surprise, as if he had never thought I could love him. Maybe that was true. Maybe in all these years I had never shown him my true feelings, hiding them behind a mask of strictness and control. What now? He finally asked. What are you going to do? I smiled, looking at them both, frightened, confused, waiting for an explosion that never came. Right now, I'll finish my tea. I took a sip. And in general? We'll see. You can't erase 43 years with one conversation, can you? They exchanged glances again, clearly not understanding my calmness. I didn't understand it myself. Maybe it was a defensive reaction. Maybe it was shock. Or maybe it was just acceptance of the inevitable. In the meantime, I continued, I suggest you both relax. I'm not going to make a scene, kick Ebner out of the house, or forbid you to see each other. Life is too short for such drama, especially when your heart has already failed you once. Are you serious? Ebner looked at me suspiciously. Absolutely, I nodded. Of course. I would appreciate it if you would show some discretion. Meet outside the house, or at least warn me so I can find something else to do. Siona looked completely confused. You're not angry with me? You don't despise me? My dear, I smiled gently at her. Anger and contempt are too heavy emotions for my sick heart. Besides, looking at you now, I see not a cunning seductress, but simply a woman who has found comfort and joy with a man who has obviously shown you his best side, a side that I may not have seen in a long time. She looked at me with wide eyes, clearly not knowing how to respond to my words. Tell me, Sion, I continued, do you love Ebner? Her cheeks flushed, but she did not look away. Yes, she said quietly, I do. And you, Ebner? I turned to my husband. Do you love Siona? He swallowed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Yes, he finally said. I love her. I nodded, as if I had received the expected answer. Well, then we need to find a way to exist in this new reality. I don't want to lose the home that has been mine for 40 years. I'm sure you, Siona, don't want Ebner to move in with you and become a burden. And you, Ebner, don't want to be left without a roof over your head in your old age. Ebner looked as if he was about to object, but then changed his mind. Siona looked at her hands, nervously fidgeting with her fingers. So, I propose a compromise, I concluded. Ebner and I will continue to live as neighbors, and you two will continue to date, observing certain boundaries. That will suit us all, at least for the time being. Worsha, are you really ready for this? Ebner looked at me in amazement. Do I have a choice? I shrugged. At my age and with my health, the prospect of starting all over again doesn't seem appealing, and I don't want to waste time and energy on a pointless war with you two. Ebner and Siona exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe their luck. They had expected shouting, tears, threats, but instead received calm acceptance of the situation. This confused them more than any storm could have. But now, if you don't mind, I'd like to rest, I said, getting up from the table. It's been a busy day, and I need to take my medicine. Of course! Siona also stood up. I think I'll go. Thank you for your understanding, Myrna. You're welcome, dear. I smiled at her. We'll talk again, I'm sure. I have a lot of questions for you. She nodded, glancing uncertainly at Ebner. I'll walk you out, he said to her, and turned to me. I'll be back soon. Take your time. I waved my hand. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about after today. They left, and I remained sitting at the kitchen table, listening to their footsteps fade away, the front door slam, and Siona's car start up outside. Only when the sound of the engine faded into the distance did I allow myself to lower my shoulders and exhale. My reaction surprised even me. I expected to explode with anger, to scream, accuse, threaten. But instead, I felt a strange calm, almost detachment. It was as if I were watching what was happening from the outside, like a spectator in a theater, rather than a participant in the drama. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was a defensive reaction. Or maybe, somewhere deep down, I understood that our marriage with Ebner had long since turned into a habit, a routine, a comfortable symbiosis, but not a union of loving people. And his affair with Siona was only the natural result of decades of emotional loneliness. But one thing I knew for sure, my ostensible humility and friendliness were just a mask. Behind them lay a plan that was just beginning to take shape in my head. A plan that would allow me to learn everything about Siona Nolt, her hopes, her fears, her vulnerabilities, and then use that knowledge to protect myself and my home. Because despite all my talk of compromise, I had no intention of sharing Ebner with anyone else. Not after 43 years of marriage. Not after everything I had invested in our life. And if that meant pretending to be understanding and generous, well, I could play that part. I got up and started clearing the cups from the table. The first act of the play had been performed, and the audience, Ebner and Siona, believed in my transformation. Now I had to prepare for the second act, which would require even more skill on my part. 2 weeks had passed since the day I caught Ebner and Siona in our bedroom. 2 weeks of my carefully staged performance called The Understanding Wife. During that time, our life had taken on a strange, almost surreal character. Ebner and Siona met openly, without hiding from me. He brought her to our house when I was home, as if testing the limits of my patience. I invariably greeted them with a smile and offered them tea. My ostensible friendliness alarmed them at first, but gradually they relaxed, believing in the sincerity of my intentions. Ebner even admitted once that he did not expect such understanding from me. "You've always been so strict, so principled," he said, when we were alone after Siona left. "I thought you would kick me out of the house." "Years teach wisdom," I replied with a smile, "and illness teaches humility." He believed me. Of course he did. Ebner always took my words at face value, never trying to look deeper, to see hidden motives. This made him vulnerable to manipulation, first by me, now by Siona, and soon by me again. I began my investigation with the simplest things. I invited Siona to lunch, ostensibly to get to know her better. She came with a bottle of wine and a box of pastries, clearly nervous, not knowing what to expect. At lunch, I was all smiles. I asked her about her work, her family, her past. At first, she answered cautiously, then more and more openly. I learned that her marriage had fallen apart because her husband had cheated on her with her best friend, that she had a difficult relationship with her mother, who had never approved of her choices, that she had been teased as a child for her freckles and still had a complex about them. Small pieces of information, insignificant on their own, but together forming a picture of a person with vulnerabilities and pain points. "You know," I said, pouring her more wine, "Ebner and I weren't always the perfect couple either." She looked at me in surprise. "Really?" "He said you'd been together your whole lives." "Oh, yes," I smiled. 43 years. But there were incidents. "Incidents?" She put down her glass, intrigued. "Ebner wasn't always faithful," I said with feigned sadness. "You're not the first, Siona. There was Clara's teacher, our daughter. Then the secretary from the post office. In the 90s, the neighbor from down the street." Her face changed, and doubt flashed in her eyes. "He never mentioned—" "Of course he didn't," I sighed. "Men don't like to talk about their mistakes, especially when they start a new relationship." It was a lie. Ebner had never cheated on me, until Siona. But she couldn't know that. And that little lie sowed the first seed of doubt in her mind. The next day, I made an appointment at the Aphrodite Beauty Salon where Siona worked. I deliberately chose a time when she was supposed to be there. The meeting went as I expected, with awkwardness and forced smiles. "Mrs. Dougling!" Siona looked as if she had seen a ghost. "I didn't know you were our client." I decided to try something new. I smiled at her, and then at the other salon employees. "Siona praised your salon so much. We're close friends now." You know, I paused deliberately, allowing them to interpret my words in their own way. Judging by their glances and whispers, they had something to gossip about. While I was getting my manicure, I chatted casually with the technician, an elderly woman named Doris, who had worked at the salon since it opened. "Siona is a wonderful administrator," I said, looking at my nails, "and she's very close to my husband." Doris raised her eyebrows. "Really? Are they friends?" "Oh, more than friends," I smiled mysteriously. "But I don't mind. At our age, you start to see things differently." I noticed Siona tense up behind the reception desk, obviously overhearing our conversation. "Of course," I continued louder. "Ebner has always been fickle in his interests. One thing today, another tomorrow. But what can you do? That's just how men are, right? Doris nodded, clearly intrigued, while Siona turned pale and looked away. As I left the salon, I noticed the employees gathering around Siona, bombarding her with questions. My work was done. The rumors had spread. That evening, Siona came to our house. She looked upset, and her eyes betrayed her anxiety. Myrna, she said when we were alone in the kitchen. Ebner was watching TV in the living room. Why did you come to the salon? Can't I visit the salon where my husband's friend works? I smiled innocently. You know what I mean. Her voice trembled. Everyone is gossiping now. They think that we. Isn't that the case? I raised an eyebrow. Aren't you dating my husband? Yes, but. She hesitated. It looks like I destroyed your family. Isn't that the case? I shrugged. Anyway, don't worry. I don't blame anyone. As I said, Ebner has always been prone to distractions. You mentioned other women. She lowered her voice. Is that true? Of course, I nodded seriously. Ebner doesn't like to talk about it, but there have been several episodes during our life together. It's always the same story. He swears that this time it's serious, that she's special. Then he cools off and comes back to the family. Her face reflected a whole range of emotions, from disbelief to concern. But he said he'd never been as happy as he was with me, she muttered. He says that to everyone, dear. I patted her hand. Don't take it to heart. That's just Ebner. In the days that followed, I continued my game. At every opportunity, I shared with Siona memories of Ebner's past infidelities, his habit of lying, his inability to take responsibility. Many of the stories were made up, but some were based on real events from our lives, distorted to make Ebner look as bad as possible. I remember when he forgot to pick up Clara from school, I said, as the three of us ate dinner. She waited 2 hours in the rain, caught a cold, and came down with pneumonia. Ebner looked puzzled. I don't remember that happening. Of course you don't, dear. I smiled at him. You forget a lot of things. Like that time you forgot to pay the mortgage, and we almost had to sell the house. Or when you spent our savings on shares in a company that went bankrupt a month later. Myrna, I never bought any shares. He frowned. See, Siona? I turned to her. He even forgot that. I noticed how, after each such conversation, Siona became more and more pensive, looking at Ebner with increasing doubt in her eyes. Her initial charm gradually gave way to wariness. At the same time, I continued to visit the Aphrodite salon, each time sharing new revelations about my family life with the stylists. They eagerly hung on my every word, then passed it on in a distorted form to their clients. Soon the whole salon was buzzing like a beehive, discussing Siona and her affair with a married man who, according to rumors, had a whole history of similar relationships. Once, I accidentally let slip that Ebner had health problems that could affect his male abilities. This information, of course, instantly spread throughout the salon. Poor Siona, I heard one of the stylists whisper. She got involved with an old man who's useless even in bed. I paid special attention to studying Siona's past. From our conversations, I learned that her ex-husband, who had left her for a female friend, still had an influence on her. Just mentioning his name made her nervous. I found him on social media, an attractive man named Brian Ash, who worked at an advertising agency in Sacramento. Pretending to be a caring friend, I cautiously hinted to Siona that I had heard Brian had broken up with that woman and often thought about her. It was pure fiction, but I could see how excited she was by this information. Did he really talk about me? She asked, trying to appear indifferent. That's what I was told. I shrugged. He probably realized what a mistake he made when he left you. I noticed that after that conversation, she began to check her phone more often, as if waiting for a message from her ex. Every day, I added a new thread to my web. A little lie here, a half-truth there, a casually dropped phrase that made her think. Siona gradually became entangled in this web without realizing it. Ebner also began to notice changes in her behavior. One evening, when she left earlier than usual, citing a headache, he approached me with a concerned look. "Myrna, do you know what happened to Siona? She's been kind of distant lately." "Maybe she's starting to see the real you," I replied, without looking at him. "What do you mean?" "Nothing special," I shrugged. "It's just that infatuation wears off, and people start to notice each other's flaws." "It's normal," he frowned but didn't continue the conversation. I could see that my words had hurt him and sowed doubt in his mind. That was exactly what I wanted. A month after starting my operation, I was already seeing clear results. Siona came less and less often, and when she did, she was tense and silent. Ebner looked confused and depressed, not understanding what was happening to their relationship. One day, I overheard their conversation in the backyard. They didn't know I had returned from the store and could hear them through the open kitchen window. "You've changed, Ebner," Siona said. "Or maybe I've just started to see things I didn't notice before." "What are you talking about?" His voice sounded concerned. "Your past relationships, your irresponsibility, the fact that you can't seem to be honest with anyone, including yourself. Did Myrna tell you that?" His voice took on a note of anger. "She's lying." "Why would she lie?" Sion objected. "She accepts our relationship. She's kind to me. She has no reason to make up stories. She's manipulating you, can't you see?" He almost shouted. "She's always done it. Quietly, unnoticed, like a spider spinning a web." I smiled at the comparison. How accurately he described my actions. Yes, I was a spider, and Siona was a fly caught in my trap. And with every movement, she became more and more entangled. "I don't know who to believe," Siona said after a pause. "But I know I need time to think. About us. About what I really want." "Siona, please." His voice softened. "Don't let her come between us." "It's not about Myrna," she replied. "It's that I'm no longer sure I know you, Ebner. And I need to figure that out before I can move forward." I heard footsteps and hurried away from the window, pretending I had just entered the house with groceries. A minute later, Siona walked through the kitchen to the exit, barely nodding to me. Her eyes were red from crying. "Are you okay, dear?" I asked with feigned concern. "Yes, just—" "I have to go," she said quickly, leaving without waiting for an answer. Ebner followed her, his face contorted with anger. "What did you say to her?" he asked, coming up close to me. "Only the truth," I replied calmly, continuing to sort through the groceries. "About you. About us. About who you really are. You're lying to her to drive a wedge between us." "Really?" I looked up at him. "Or maybe I'm just helping her see what I've seen all these years. A weak, indecisive man, incapable of taking responsibility for his actions." He recoiled as if I had hit him. "You never loved me," he said quietly. "To you, I was always just a project, a puppet you could control." "And you were never man enough to stand up to me," I retorted, "until you met Siona. And look how quickly that charm is wearing off. She's already starting to see the real you, Ebner, and she doesn't like it." He clenched his fists, but then relaxed, dropping his shoulders. "I won't let you ruin this relationship too, Myrna," he said wearily. "You won't win this time." He left the kitchen, leaving me alone. I continued sorting through the groceries, humming to myself. My web was getting stronger and stronger, and the fly in it was getting weaker and weaker. Soon it would be time for the decisive blow. A week after Ebner and Siona's quarrel, I decided it was time for the final act of my plan. They had made up. Of course they had. Ebner begged her to believe him, not me, swearing to his sincerity, and Siona, still in love, wanted to believe him. But the seed of doubt I had sown had already sprouted, and now it only took a little effort for it to blossom into full-blown mistrust. I decided to host a dinner party. It was a typical family dinner, to which I invited Siona and a few old acquaintances, people who had known Ebner and me for decades. Ted and his wife Martha, our neighbor Elizabeth Pierce, and Howard Greenwood, Ebner's former colleague from the post office. They were surprised by the invitation. After my surgery, we rarely had guests, but they were even more surprised by my explanation. "I want to introduce you to Ebner's girlfriend," I said to Martha on the phone. "Siona. She's charming, and I think you should get to know her." Ebner's girlfriend? Martha sounded stunned. But how? "Oh, don't worry," I laughed easily. "I know about and fully support their relationship. At my age, you begin to value other people's happiness more than your own pride." I had the same conversation with the other guests. No one could believe that I was so calm about my husband's affair, but everyone was too intrigued to decline the invitation. Ebner was against the idea from the start. "Why?" he asked when I told him about my plans. "Siona and I don't need public approval." "It's not about approval, dear," I replied gently. "It's about accepting a new reality. Our friends need to know that I don't hold a grudge against you, that we can all be civilized adults." He looked at me suspiciously, but couldn't find any rational arguments against it. After all, I was only showing understanding and support. Shona also had doubts when Ebner passed on my invitation to her. She called me herself, for the first time in our strange relationship. "Myrna, are you sure this is a good idea?" Her voice sounded uncertain. "Meeting your friends. It's so formal." "Darling," I said warmly, "if you and Ebner are serious, sooner or later you'll have to meet the people in our circle. It's better to do it in a friendly atmosphere. With my blessing, I just don't want anyone to feel awkward," she muttered. "No one will feel awkward," I assured her. "I've explained everything, and everyone is looking forward to meeting you." On the day of the dinner, I outdid myself. I prepared exquisite dishes, brought out the best wine, and decorated the table with fresh flowers. I put on my favorite dark blue dress, which, despite my age, still fit me well. I looked impeccable, an elegant older lady welcoming guests into her home. Ebner watched my preparations with growing concern. He knew me too well to believe in the sincerity of my intentions, but he couldn't understand what exactly I had in mind. "You look tense, dear," I remarked, adjusting his tie. "Relax. Tonight will be a wonderful evening." He didn't answer, just nodded, but I could see the disbelief in his eyes. The guests began arriving at 7. Ted and Martha were the first to arrive, with a bottle of wine and awkward smiles. They had known Ebner almost as long as I had, and they were clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Myrna, you look gorgeous," Martha said, hugging me. "How's your health?" "Better every day," I replied with a smile. "Dr. Bird says I'm recovering faster than expected." Elizabeth and Howard arrived shortly after, and a few minutes later, Siona appeared. She looked impeccable in a modest green dress, minimal makeup, and her hair pulled back into a simple style. Nothing provocative or inappropriate. The smart girl understood the importance of making a good first impression. Ebner met her at the door, and I noticed him whisper something in her ear. A warning, no doubt. But it was too late for warnings. I introduced Siona to the other guests with such enthusiasm, as if she were the sister-in-law I had always dreamed of having. Siona works as an administrator at the Aphrodite Beauty Salon, I said. She's very organized and so good at dealing with difficult clients. Ebner is simply charmed by her, and I understand why. Siona blushed with embarrassment, and our guests exchanged glances, unsure how to react to such open approval of my husband's romance. Over aperitifs, the conversation was tense and intermittent. No one knew which topics were safe and which might lead to awkwardness. I deliberately maintained this atmosphere, enjoying Ebner's discomfort and Siona's confusion. When we sat down at the table, I took my place at the head as the hostess. I seated Ebner to my right and Siona opposite him, next to Howard. It was a strategic decision. Howard was always talkative after a couple of glasses of wine, and he had a habit of reminiscing about old stories, especially those that made Ebner uncomfortable. During the first course, I steered the conversation in a safe direction. We discussed the weather, the latest city news, and the upcoming festival. Gradually, everyone relaxed. The wine did its job, and by the time the main course was served, the atmosphere was almost casual. That's when I started my game. Elizabeth, do you remember when Ebner promised to fix your porch? I asked, serving her the roast. I think it was about 10 years ago. Elizabeth, an elderly lady with a sharp tongue, snorted. How could I forget? He swore he'd finish it over the weekend, and then he disappeared for 2 weeks. When he finally showed up, he said he'd forgotten. I had to hire professionals. The porch was completely rotten by then. Ebner shifted in his chair. I had a lot of work at the time, he muttered. You always say that, dear. I smiled sweetly at him. Remember how you promised to help Clara with her science project? She waited for you all evening, but you never showed up. I don't remember that, he frowned. Of course you don't, I sighed. Clara cried all night. It was an important project. Her grade depended on it. I had to help her myself, even though I didn't understand anything about chemistry. Siona listened attentively, her gaze shifting from me to Ebner and back again. Ebner was always a little absent-minded, I continued, addressing everyone. He always forgot his promises. Right, Ted? Ted, who had already had quite a bit to drink, nodded enthusiastically. I remember how he promised to help me with the boat. 5 years have passed, and nothing has been done, he laughed good-naturedly. But I'm not offended. That's just the kind of person he is. What kind of person? I asked innocently. Well, you know, Ted hesitated. A little unreliable, but with a heart of gold. Unreliable, I repeated thoughtfully. That's a good word. Softer than untrustworthy. Ebner paled, and Siona tensed, putting down her fork. But everyone has flaws, Martha quickly added, trying to smooth over the awkwardness. My Ted, for example, snores like a locomotive. Everyone laughed, except Ebner and Siona. I continued to smile as I filled the guests' glasses. Tell us, Howard. I turned to Ebner's former colleague. How did he do at work? Was he just as unreliable? Howard, flushed from the wine, chuckled. Well, there were instances, he began. I remember when the boss gave him an important delivery, and he forgot it in the sorting room. The package was only found a week later. It was a huge scandal. I didn't forget it, Ebner protested. It was mislabeled. But you signed for it, Howard reminded him. And then you tried to pin the blame on the new guy. Remember that kid? What was his name? Leon, I prompted. Ebner talked about him all the time at home. How he tried to frame the poor boy. I didn't frame anyone. Ebner raised his voice. It was a misunderstanding. Of course, dear. I patted his hand. Just like that time with the tax return when you forgot to report your additional income. Siona now looked at Ebner with wide eyes. They showed confusion and growing concern. Myrna, maybe we should change the subject, Elizabeth suggested, sensing the growing tension. Oh, of course, I smiled. Let's talk about something more pleasant. For example, how Ebner and Siona met. It's such a romantic story. In the park, reading a book. You met in the park? Martha asked, clearly relieved to switch to a new topic. Siona nodded, but before she could answer, I continued. It reminded me of how Ebner met Joan. Do you remember, dear? Also in the park. Only then you were walking the neighbor's dog. Ebner turned even paler. I don't know what you're talking about, he said hoarsely. Joan Larson. I pretended to be surprised by his reaction. You were seeing her when Clara was about 10. Remember when I found her letters in your pocket? We almost got divorced. Then Ted and Martha exchanged worried glances. Howard stared at his plate. Elizabeth nervously sipped her wine. Sion looked at Ebner, waiting for his answer. It was a misunderstanding, he muttered. We were just friends. Of course, friends, I smiled. Just like with Beatrice from accounting. And with Sandra, Nathan's teacher. And with Melissa, who sold insurance. They were all just friends. There was a heavy silence. Siona looked as if she had been punched in the gut. Ebner sat with his head down, not daring to look at anyone. Myrna, Martha began cautiously, maybe you shouldn't. What? I stood up, feigning righteous indignation. Shouldn't tell the truth? Siona has a right to know who she's involved with. She has a right to know that she's just one in a long line of women Ebner swore his love to, and then abandoned when things got difficult. That's not true. Ebner stood up too, his face contorted with anger. You're making it all up. Making it up? I laughed bitterly. Maybe you should tell everyone how I found you in bed with Clara's nanny? How you begged me not to kick you out of the house. How you swore it was the only time, and then I found someone else's hair on your clothes and smelled someone else's perfume. Siona slowly rose from the table. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I need some air. She headed for the dining room door. Ebner rushed after her. Siona, wait! She's lying. It wasn't like that. I leaned back in my chair, watching them disappear down the hallway. The other guests sat in shock, not knowing how to react to the drama that had just unfolded. I apologize for this spectacle, I said, returning to my usual calm tone. But it's better for her to know the truth now than later, when it's too late. Myrna, Elizabeth looked at me doubtfully. I've known you and Ebner for almost 30 years, and I've never heard about these affairs. Of course you haven't, I shrugged. We tried not to air our dirty laundry in public. For the sake of the children, you understand loud voices came from the hallway. Ebner was arguing something, and Siona was responding through tears. Then the front door slammed. A minute later, Ebner returned to the dining room. His face was white with rage. Are you satisfied? He asked, looking at me with hatred. You got what you wanted. I only told the truth, I replied calmly. If the truth destroyed your relationship, then perhaps it was built on lies from the beginning. He shook his head, too angry to speak. Then he turned to the guests. I'm sorry, he said hoarsely. The evening is over. I must find Sion, and he left, leaving me with 4 bewildered guests at a table laden with uneaten dishes. Well, I said, raising my glass, who wants dessert? They looked at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Perhaps they were. All these years, I had played the role of the perfect wife, hiding my true nature behind a mask of politeness. Now the mask had slipped, and they saw what I was capable of. No one stayed for dessert. They left shortly after Ebner, muttering awkward apologies and avoiding my gaze. I didn't blame them. They had witnessed the destruction of a family they considered exemplary, and it was not a pleasant sight. Left alone, I slowly cleared the table, washed the dishes, and polished the countertops until they shone. The house was quiet, only the ticking of the clock breaking the silence. Ebner did not return after an hour or two. I did not wait for him. I knew he was trying to find Sion, to explain himself to her, to convince her that I was lying. But I also knew that the seed of doubt I had sown over the past few weeks, which had finally sprouted today, would do its job. Sanaa would no longer look at him with the same adoration. She would see in him what I wanted her to see: a weak, deceitful, cowardly man, incapable of true love. When I finished cleaning, I sat down in my armchair in the living room with a glass of sherry. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely satisfied. My plan had worked even better than I had expected. Public humiliation, exposure in front of his friends, in front of his mistress. Ebner would not recover from this blow any time soon, if ever. Outside the window, rain began to fall, drumming softly on the roof. I listened to the sound, sipping my sherry and thinking about what would happen next. Ebner might not come back today. Maybe he would find shelter with a friend or rent a room in a motel. But sooner or later, he would have to return. He had neither the money nor the courage to start a new life at 70. And when he returns, I will be here, in this house that has always been more mine than his. And I will wait to see how the man who dared to betray me after 43 years of marriage finally breaks. The rain intensified, turning into a real downpour. I finished my sherry and got up from my chair. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I had to be rested to face it fully prepared. As I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, I heard the front door slam. Ebner returned, soaked to the skin, with a dull look in his eyes and his shoulders slumped. He didn't even look in my direction, heading straight for the guest bedroom. I smiled. Everything was going according to plan.